Hey, welcome back to the channel. We're glad you stopped in. This is part 2 of the Cold Smoker Smokehouse. Today, I'm going to show pictures of the build of the smokehouse that I built last year that we toured in part 1. If you've not yet seen part 1, you can go over to the Variety Homestead channel and check it out. When the smokehouse was built, I didn't consider videoing anything at that time, but I did want to document it somehow, and I'm glad I did. What I'm going to do today is to narrate through the slides a blow-by-blow account of what was happening at the time and point out some features and maybe some techniques that I used. I hope you enjoy this, and maybe it will give you some ideas that you can use if you decide to build one. I did not have a set of plans for this, but I did do a few sketches to get a cut list and a diagram for the layout of the cinder blocks. Because it was not detailed enough, I was constantly tweaking things as I went along, but in the end, it turned out okay. As I said in part 1, I got the general layout idea from searching YouTube videos on smokehouses and cold smokers, and there's several of them out there that use a very similar form. A couple of changes that I will probably make in the future will be to add some metal to the top so as to overhang a little bit more than it currently does, and put a screen over the hole that's inside the smokehouse stovepipe. What you're looking at here is the build site itself. This is located behind my lean-to that's attached to my workshop, and apparently there was a building or a shed here many years ago because there was a thin concrete pad that was poured over a layer of bricks that were laid out as a floor or some sort of a foundation. The pad had a noticeable dip in it, so what I did was use some leftover crush and run I had to level and flatten the foundation. If you look to the right side of the picture, you can see a stack of regular cinder blocks, 24 in all, and to the right of that is a tarp. Under that tarp is all of the wood, all of the various other things like concrete and mortar. They were all stored there as I built this smokehouse. I built this out of untreated, common, cheap pine lumber. The walls are 1x8 boards. Some were bought and some were salvaged from the back of a company that built crates. And they were moving, and they were throwing these bunch of boards away of various lengths, so I threw them into the back of the truck. I also used 2x4s and 4x4s, some of which I had and some of which I bought. Not in the picture is a supply of metal roofing that my neighbor had salvaged from a building that he helped to tear down, and he offered some to me, and I was very happy to accept. Next, I laid 2 courses of cinder blocks so I could get an approximate 4-foot by 5-foot structure. I filled in certain holes in the block with crush and run, and I left certain other holes empty so that I could fill those in with concrete and insert the concrete sleeve anchors into that concrete. If you look closely to the left of the 2x4 that's pictured here, you can see where I inserted and concreted one of the anchors in. I used that particular piece of 2x4 scrap to guide the placement of the anchors in the block holes I was going to place the anchors into so they would be uniform around the base. Now this is the other side where you can see I laid down 1 block on its side. This was so that I could insert the pipe into the interior of the smokehouse and subsequently attach a 90-degree elbow that would come up through the floor. I used the right hole in the picture you see for the pipe to pass through. The left hole I filled in with some half bricks that were laying around. I've got plenty of old bricks and half bricks and pieces of bricks in this general area, I think because this is where a structure once stood. You can also see in the foreground the rest of the pad that was originally there. At this point, I have inserted all of the remaining bolts. I measured and cut the bottom plate 2x4s and drilled holes for the bolts to come through. But I have not yet put the nuts and washers on. I was working real gingerly at this point because, as I remember, the concrete had not dried sufficiently at this time, and time was limited due to my job, so I was doing as much as I could in the time that I had. This is another shot of the same, but on the firebox side. At this point, I removed the 2x4s and used them as the bottom plates for my wall frames. I had to be really careful to mark which was which so that when I built the frames, they would go back in their original bolt holes. None of those 2x4s were interchangeable. After I built the frames, I stood them up in a wall frame fashion and screwed them together, checking for plumb and square as I went along. I basically made a box and then split the difference on the inside studs since it was a 4x5. In the front, which you can see here, I did frame in for a 30-inch door. You can see where I inserted the 90-degree elbow and a length of stovepipe and filled in the floor area with crush and run. I put a 2x4 ridge beam up on the top and put one screw in each of the rafters just to hold them in place at the ridge beam while I worked on the spacing and the supports. This is a side view of where you can see the rafters on the top plate attached to the ridge beam. You can also see some of the framing as well as the stovepipe elbow coming through the floor. As an additional note, when I shoveled in the crush and run, I spread it out as evenly as possible and tamped it every few inches with a 10-pound tamper so as to compact it. Here's a front view that shows the long rafters. They're approximately 10 feet long, and the 4x4 supports that they sit on. I used those blocks that they sell at Lowe's that are sort of triangle shaped as a footing for those 4x4s. You can also see the firebox just to the right of the 4x4 supports. I played with the placement of the firebox several times throughout the build, trying to make sure that it would be under the roof for those times when it rained, and yet be far enough from the smokehouse itself so that the smoke would cool off by the time it got inside the smoker. Here you can see the cross pieces in the rafters. All I did here was to space them evenly so that screwing down the metal would be easier and hold better during windy days. You can also see the firebox in the foreground. And here it is with the metal installed on the roof. I used some metal caulking to fix various holes and cracks in the metal from the old screw holes, and then my wife and I painted the metal with a paint that's similar to aluminum fence paint. I don't remember exactly what it was called or the brand, but it has held up very well so far. Now this is the other side showing the roof installed. I used 1.25-inch metal roof screws with the rubber washers on them to attach the roofing. And this is the back side of the smokehouse after we nailed up all of the 1x8 boards. These were the cheapest pine boards that Lowe's and Home Depot carry. That, along with the boards that I was able to acquire from the back of in an office park, is what we used. Notice that I only went up close to the top of the rectangle with all the walls. This is the front view of the walls with the door opening. I routed out the 1x8s to make my own shiplap. Now I only had a 3/8 inch deep by 1/4 inch high rabbet bit, so I had to route each rabbet twice. First at a 1/4 inch groove and then reset the bit to 1/8 inch and do it all over again. It took a really long time, but the result was worth it because it sealed up the walls really well and does not allow for smoke to escape. My plan was to use the short boards of the 1x8s and run them vertically at the top section with them rabbeted also into shiplap. And this is an angle shot of the previous picture just for some context. I put my chair under the roof and was still playing with the firebox location. I'd already decided that I was going to have some sort of wood storage under the long roof, but I had not decided what kind of platform I wanted to use. Now, I've seen some that had various sections for the different woods all measured out, but they used a lot of material and could be pretty intricate, and I was not excited about doing all that at this point, but your mileage may vary. Okay, here's the backside again, this time showing the vertical boards at the top, and where I intentionally left the center cut out to act as a chimney. I did it this way because I didn't want to spend money on a whole chimney setup, and I had seen at least one video, maybe more, where something similar was done, and by the way, it works just fine. Okay, back to the front side again, showing the vertical boards in place at the top. By this time in the build, I was also measuring and working on the door itself and collecting up the hardware that I was going to use. Unfortunately, this particular picture is the only one that I took that shows the shiplap from the side. I tried, but I couldn't blow this picture up enough so that you can see the detail. Basically, it's just a 3/8 by 3/8 rabbet that the boards interlock into. So if you are able to blow it up, you might know some trick or technique so that you can see it up close for yourself. Here's the front view with the door installed. The door itself is just a 2x frame with planks screwed on. Very, very simple. If you look closely, you can see a small bolt latch just over the door handle itself. I really didn't like the way the latch fit, and it was really too small for what I wanted, so I ended up replacing it. Now at this stage, I have still not attached the stovepipe permanently, but I did cut it to length and dry fit it, and it was going to get in the way during the painting phase, so it is not in this picture. All right, here is the finished smokehouse. My wife and I painted this with a darker red, like a burgundy outdoor paint that we had used on several other things, like my shooting bench and my range furniture. You can see where I replaced the little door bolt latch with a larger one and relocated it to just under the door handle. I purchased a thermometer online and installed it just about eye height. I think it is 6-inch thermometer. It works great and it's really easy to install. Over time, with humidity and rain, I have had to plane off some of the door bottom and the lower left side due to the wood swelling. And this was so that the door would open easier and still not let any smoke out. Now for the wood storage area, I finally decided that I would build a simple frame to hold a pallet and that I had laying around to finish my wood platform, and loaded it up with totes that I had laying around and the wood in the totes. It's not the best looking solution, but it's working okay for now. I typically use cherry, oak, hickory, apple, and a lot of pecan. I have 10 pecan trees on my property, and since they are self-pruning, I have no shortage of pecan wood. Some people say pecan. To date, I have so far smoked cold smoked bacon, side meat, jowl, and most recently 2 small hams, which you will have noticed hanging in the smokehouse if you watched part 1 of this particular video. And all of that was done, of course, after salt curing. You can absolutely build one of these, and you can probably build one in your neighborhood unless you're bound by, covenants and restrictions. And if it's one of those things that you don't see you might have too much of a use for, you could go in with a relative or a close friend or a neighbor and share the cost. And you could also share the benefits as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, hit the like button, and thanks for visiting Variety Homestead.